So here's a question. This might be for best for Dinah. Was it normal to not receive the land in Canada that was promised to the slaves that traveled there? Did the majority receive land or get excuses and never really get it? I say this because that's what happened to the Indians in Oklahoma. So I was curious if you know what happened.
Yeah, that is what happened. I think the story, if I had another career, I would do more research on the blacks that went to not just Nova Scotia, because we do know a lot about them. We know how many people went. We know when they went during the American Revolution. We know when they went during the War of 1812. They actually were pushed out into these smaller communities. There's one community that I visited called Buxton, which is right outside of Detroit. That community is vibrant. It's still there. There are a number of Black abolitionists from the 19th century, like Marianne Shadd Cary, who wrote, who was an abolitionist, free Black woman who moved to Canada and created a Black woman who created a newspaper in the 19th century that was similar to Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison's paper called the Freedman, the Provincial Freedman. And she would work back and forth between communities in the United States and communities in Canada. There's a whole history on Blacks in Canada. They were not always given the land that they were promised, just like the whole 40 acres and a mule here. But they made do with what they had, and they did establish communities, and they remained. And so we have a lot. There's so much more, and there's a large sort of cadre of scholars that are doing work on Blacks in Canada. And so I hope that answers your question. I know that there's probably, I don't have the level of specificity, but I do think you're absolutely right in thinking that they didn't get the land that they were promised.
We have one more question. This probably will be the last since it's 6:14. I see that the slave owners were compensated for their loss of property. Can you speak more on that or the DC Emancipated Compensation Act? If I recall, former slaves were encouraged to colonize in Haiti and offered funding, not as much as the former slave owners to do so.
Oh, I love that question. So I always say reparations for slavery were given to the enslavers. So there have been reparations that were paid. They were paid for enslavers when they lost their enslaved property. This particular War of 1812, there's a scholar, and Dr. Brown, maybe you can look this up. He's at a UVA. He got a Pulitzer Prize for it. Oh my gosh, it'll come to me in a minute. But he got a book. It's a book on the War of 1812. At any rate, I had done a lot of research on the compensation. What happened was during the War of 1812, slaveholders and slavers from all over the South wrote to the Secretary of State at the time and asked. They said, "I lost my property. They went off in the war. I wanted to be compensated." And they described like who the person was, how much they were worth, how valuable they were for their plantation. And there was from 1814 to 1828, the Emperor of Russia and a whole international committee came together to figure out how they were going to return the financial, their money to enslavers who lost enslaved property. And instead of giving them the value of each individual enslaved person, each state received an average. So if you were enslaved in Georgia and you lost three people, the average price that they were going to give was $248. If you were in Maryland, it was 300 or whatever. They came up with this figure. There were two checks that were supposed to be written to the United States government from Britain. I have not been able to trace whether or not they were written. It was something like, don't quote me on this, it was something like $28 million or something along that level. I just can't remember the number off the top of my head. They were done in two payments. But I never have been able to trace whether or not the enslavers who claimed that loss received those checks or received those reimbursements. So to answer your question, there was money that was paid for enslavers. Enslaved people were encouraged or pushed out to leave, go back to Africa. So we have a movement through the American Colonization Society, but also the African Colonization Society to start new lives in Liberia. And also in different parts of we learn later South America as well. Did African Americans receive funding for that? Not the level of funding that you would think. No. Did they? We didn't even receive the 40 acres and a mule that we were promised, the land that we were promised there. So there's acts, but we have to think about theory and practice. So there's an act that's been issued, but what happened in the day-to-day and the experiences. So enslaved people did not receive compensation. We do know that some that participated in bringing back runaways were sometimes rewarded. We do have some evidence of Black people that got they were given their freedom if they helped get runaways out of the Dismal Swamp in North Carolina and Virginia. That's just one or two examples.
So we probably need to close out, but is the author's name Alan Taylor?
Yes.
I looked it up and then someone else did too.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you.
Alan Taylor. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Dr. Berry, is it the Civil War of 1812?
Is that the name of the
Is
text?
that the name of the book?
Yeah, is
No,
that the
it's
name?
called something else.
Here,
Okay.
I think the title, I have it here.
I'll know
I
when
think
hear it. It's almost
his recent, it's called The Internal Enemy,
yes, that's it.
Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772. I'll put it in the chat now.
And we
Excellent book.
and we also put some resources by Laurent Dubois and a great book by Trio. He wrote a book called Silencing the Past, a depiction of the Haitian Revolution. Really wonderful work.
Yeah, Silence in the Past, even if you just read the introduction, it will change the way you think about and write about and teach history. I use that for the introduction for all of my classes, both undergraduate and grad, and students are blown away by what makes it into history books. So,
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating.